Godfrey of Bouillon's legendary status eclipses that of almost any other medieval knight. As a leader of the First Crusade, Godfrey and his knights were the first to storm the walls of Jerusalem, capturing the city in 1099. But who is the man behind the legend? Godfrey was the second son of Eustace II, Count of Boulogne, and an ally of William the Conqueror. Godfrey's mother was Ida, a woman revered as a saint who engaged in many charitable works. In a time when most noble ladies used wet nurses, Ida insisted on breastfeeding her own children so that she could keep them closer to her and instill them with virtue and love of God. Godfrey grew up strongly pious.
Beware! Enemy fire! Stop shouting and put him out!
In 1076, Godfrey inherited the Duchy of Lower Lorraine from his mother's brother, Godfrey the Hunchback. However, the importance of the duchy prompted the Holy Roman Emperor, Heinrich IV, to initially withhold part of Godfrey's inheritance. In these early years, Godfrey proved his abilities as a leader in battling many enemies bent on depriving him of his uncle's lands. Godfrey also proved himself a reliable ally to the Holy Roman Emperor, and by 1087, Godfrey had fully secured the Duchy of Lower Lorraine. In 1096, Godfrey responded to the call to crusade from Pope Urban II, selling or mortgaging most of his lands. Godfrey raised a considerable army and set out for the Holy Land in August. By 1099, Godfrey was one of the preeminent leaders of the Crusader host, and with his knights, he stormed the city of Jerusalem. The First Crusade had triumphed. Jerusalem, after centuries under Muslim rule, was once more a Christian-controlled city. The question now remained, could the Crusaders keep it? The First Crusade had established tiny, isolated outposts surrounded by powerful Muslim kingdoms. After the fighting ended, most of the Crusaders returned home. On July 22nd, 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon was elected to rule in Jerusalem. Popular with the ordinary soldiers, and reputed for his piety, he was a logical choice. When offered the crown, Godfrey refused to call himself king, preferring instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulcher. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, Godfrey faced the difficult task of maintaining and expanding the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had at his disposal only a few hundred knights and around 2,000 infantry. Tancred, nephew to Prince Bohemond of Antioch, had conquered Tiberias and held it as Godfrey's vassal. One of Godfrey's first actions as ruler of Jerusalem was to besiege the port city of Arsuf. Chronicler Albert of Aachen named several of Godfrey's leading knights who joined in the siege: Werner of Grez, Geldemar Carpanel, and Wicker the Swabian. The Christians bombarded the city with siege engines and mangonels. To discourage the attack, the Saracen defenders brought out a Christian hostage, Gerard of Avenant, one of Godfrey's own knights. The Saracens tied Gerard to the top of a ship's mast, which was then raised over the walls of Arsuf. Godfrey proclaimed that even if his own brother were tied to that mast, he would fight on. Gerard, certain he would die by the arrows of his own comrades, called out to the Duke, imploring him to donate his horse and arms to the Holy Sepulcher. The Christians advanced against Arsuf's walls in a great siege tower. The Saracens pelted the tower with Greek fire, and it was consumed by flames, burning up many of Godfrey's men inside. As winter drew near, the siege had made little progress. Reluctantly, the Duke called off the siege and withdrew his forces. The failure of the siege owed to the small size of Godfrey's army, as well as his lack of a navy, which left him unable to blockade Arsuf's port. By Christmas, Godfrey was back in Jerusalem. There he greeted his brother Baldwin, Count of Edessa, and Bohemond, the Norman Prince of Antioch, who'd arrived to celebrate Christmas in the Holy City. With Bohemond was Daimbert, Bishop of Pisa, a churchman keenly interested to gain power in Jerusalem. Daimbert offered Godfrey two things he desperately needed: funds for his army, and a Pisan fleet, which might have made the siege of Arsuf a success. Godfrey, indeed, could not afford to refuse, and so he and his chief men offered the patriarchate to the Pisan bishop. Thus, in December 1099, Daimbert became Patriarch of Jerusalem. At Epiphany, Godfrey, Baldwin, and Bohemond marched with their men to the river Jordan, where they bathed to commemorate the baptism of Christ. Then Bohemond and Baldwin departed the kingdom and returned to their own lands in the north. Early 1100 marked several important successes for Godfrey. He restored the defenses of the port city of Jaffa, and he secured tributary payments from the Arab rulers of Arsuf, Ashkelon, Acre, and Caesarea. He established trade policies which brought Muslim merchants to Jaffa and Jerusalem. In 1100, the Emir of Ashkelon released Gerard of Avana, Godfrey's knight who'd been tied to the mast at the siege of Arsuf. The Crusaders had assumed that Gerard had been killed during the siege, but in truth, he'd survived and been sent from Arsuf to be held at Ashkelon. Now, as part of his peace agreement with Godfrey, the Emir of Ashkelon gave Gerard his freedom. Gerard showed up in Jerusalem, dressed in fine garments and riding a horse gifted him by the Emir. Godfrey was delighted. He greeted Gerard with honor, and at once gave him, according to Albert of Aachen, very great fiefs of 100 marks of land, with the castle which is called Et St. Abraham. Not long after this, Tancred traveled to Jerusalem from the Principality of Galilee to seek counsel with Godfrey. Tancred complained that a Saracen lord, named by Albert of Aachen as the Fat Peasant, had discontinued his tributary payments. This fat peasant was so called by the Crusaders, according to Albert, quote, because of his very great corpulence and his worthless character. Unfortunately, we do not know the true name of this lord, only that his lands lay to the east of Tancred's domain in Galilee. Godfrey heeded Tancred's complaint and set out with 200 cavalry and 1,000 infantry to ravage the fat peasant's territory. The fat peasant sent an embassy to Dukak, Emir of Damascus, requesting aid against the Crusaders. Dukak sent an expeditionary force of 500 Turks, which encountered Tancred's knights and clashed with them in a bloody but inconclusive battle. Meanwhile, Duke Godfrey and his troops were wrapping up their campaign and laying camp elsewhere. Tancred at once rushed to the Duke's camp to report that he'd encountered a force from Damascus. The next morning, Godfrey and Tancred together marched out to look for the Turkish horsemen, but failed to locate them. Godfrey now returned to Jerusalem, while Tancred continued to harass the fat peasant's territory. After Godfrey again raided the region east of Galilee, the fat peasant finally submitted and paid tribute to the Crusaders. Godfrey, despite the smallness of his kingdom and army, showed himself capable of supporting his vassal and dominating nearby Saracen powers. Not long after this, Godfrey was back in Jaffa. Here, he greeted the Doge of Venice, who'd arrived with his fleet to join the forces of Jerusalem in a campaign against the Saracens. However, Godfrey was feeling ill and retired to his private house in the city. Albert describes the scene of the ailing duke attended by his knights. 4 of his companions were with him. Some took his feet onto their laps. Others supported his head so that he could lean back his upper body. Some indeed were weeping over him with very great grief and lamentation, because they were afraid of being forsaken by so great a prince in this long exile. Godfrey's condition worsened, and his men carried him back to Jerusalem. He made his confession, received communion, and at last died on July 18. Albert writes, "For 5 days there was very great lamentation and bitter weeping by all the Christians there. Solemnly, the Duke's body was laid to rest in the church of the Holy Sepulcher. Godfrey of Bouillon, the celebrated hero of the First Crusade and the first Frankish ruler of Jerusalem, was gone." Over the centuries, Godfrey would come to be regarded as one of the great heroes of Christendom, personifying the ideal crusader. In the Divine Comedy, Dante places Godfrey in the heaven of Mars alongside other warriors of the faith. In modern times, Some historians have criticized Godfrey as a poor administrator. Stephen Runciman calls him a weak, foolish man, though today medieval scholars tend to criticize Runciman for his own biases and inaccuracies. French historian Régine Pernoud writes that the only thing proved by these criticisms is that our standards are not those of the 12th century. Contemporary chroniclers are unanimous in their judgment of Godfrey as an upright and pious man. In 1100, the death of Godfrey of Bouillon wasn't the only tragedy suffered by the fledgling Crusader states. Bohemond, the Norman giant from southern Italy, had in recent months been occupied with governing and expanding the Principality of Antioch. That summer, he received a plea for assistance from Gabriel, the Armenian prince of Melitene, in eastern Anatolia. A powerful Turkish emir, Danishmend, had put Melitene to siege, and Gabriel begged Bohemond to bring relief to the city. At once the Norman giant assembled a force and struck out for Anatolia. Danishmend, aware of Bohemond's advance, ambushed the Normans as they approached the Armenian city. A fierce battle ensued. The Christians were overwhelmed, and Bohemond himself was captured. Triumphant, Danishmend returned to Melitene. He issued an ultimatum to Gabriel to surrender the city at once. Gabriel refused. Meanwhile, news of this misfortune spread quickly when survivors showed up in Antioch. From his prison, Bohemond sent a lock of his own hair to Baldwin of Boulogne, ruler of the county of Edessa, and brother to Godfrey of Bouillon. The hair was a prearranged sign of distress between the two rulers. Assembling the knights of Antioch and Edessa, Baldwin at once marched on the plains of Melitene, seeking to engage Danishmend and possibly rescue Bohemond. For 3 days, Baldwin tracked the Turkish horsemen, though he never caught up with them. At last, he retired to Melitene. There, Gabriel swore vassalage to Baldwin, who established a Frankish garrison in the city before returning to Edessa. With Baldwin departed, Danishmend again besieged Melitene, but the Frankish garrison managed to defend the town, and the Turks withdrew. Once he was back in Edessa, Baldwin received envoys from his brother Godfrey's followers in Jerusalem. Godfrey was dead, the messengers explained, and they urged Baldwin to ride at once for the Holy City so that he could assume his brother's throne. The chronicler, Fulcher of Chartres, who was in Baldwin's service at the time, tells us that he grieved somewhat over the death of his brother, but rejoiced more over his inheritance. At once Baldwin conferred the county of Edessa on his kinsman, Baldwin of Bourg, an important member of Godfrey of Bouillon's entourage during the First Crusade. Then, he assembled 200 knights and 700 infantry and set off on the 5-week journey south for Jerusalem. After resting briefly in Antioch, Baldwin continued to Tripoli. There, the local emir provided him with supplies as well as bad news. Dukak, the Turkish emir of Damascus, was apparently raising an army to oppose Baldwin's advance. This was particularly troubling because the Christians would soon have to pass through a narrow crossing, ideal for ambush as they approached the city of Beirut. Chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, a French priest, was with Baldwin throughout this journey, and his account is vivid and visceral. Fulcher says that Baldwin's scouts rode to the narrow defile and saw Turks stationed there. They reported to Baldwin that a large force was likely hidden ahead. Baldwin immediately organized his troops for battle, and carefully they advanced. The vanguard encountered the Turks, sparring with them briefly. The terrain was steep and dangerous, and the Crusaders could not be sure of the location or even the size of the Turkish army. Daylight was fading, and Baldwin elected to lay camp and defend their position. The Crusaders then passed a terrifying night, fending off the Turks. Fulcher recounts the experience. On all sides we were besieged by our enemies. On one side, those in boats on the sea. On the other, those from the cliffs pressed upon us. Indeed, I wished very much that I were in Chartres or Orléans, and so did others. All that night, we languished outside our tents, keeping very watchful. By morning, the Crusaders decided that their position was untenable. Organizing the army in a close formation, Baldwin commanded a withdrawal. Both Fulcher and the chronicler Albert of Aachen tell us that the Christians hoped to draw the Turks to a site more favorable for battle. The maneuver worked. The Turks pursued the Crusaders up the mountain road to a level plain. Here, the Christian heavy cavalry could operate with maximum effectiveness. Baldwin told his knights to turn and lower their lances. In a sudden burst, the Crusaders charged and mowed down their pursuers. Fulcher of Chartres attributed the victory to God. He gave our men bravery of such quality that when they turned suddenly, they put their enemies to flight down a three-branched road, with the result that the latter never had a thought of defending themselves. Some betook themselves to a precipice, some fled hastily elsewhere to a place of safety, while still others were overtaken and put to the sword. This engagement, known as the Battle of the Dog River, was a serious victory over the Emir of Damascus. Large numbers of Dukak's men were slain, and Baldwin took prisoner many important Turkish noblemen, 48 according to Albert of Aachen. The Crusaders now carried on unopposed to Jerusalem.